Number 1. I have been a nurse for the past 40 years. During this time I have seen and dealt with some pretty messed up things. Due to my line of work, I can't reveal all. So instead, I will share a few experiences that have stuck with me, and in no particular order either. A client in her 70s refused to go inside the ward to go to bed, saying she would prefer to sleep outside, despite the fact it was the middle of winter and it was very cold. We could not convince her to go inside, as she said she didn't want the white lady to take her. Eventually, after much effort, we gave up and covered her with blankets and let her sleep outside. In the morning, it was discovered that another client in the ward had died. I am aware of this happening on another 3 occasions, where she refused to stay in the ward and clients died. The woman, however, was perfectly fine. Bear in mind, this was the late 70s, and white lady funerals was established in the late 80s. The worst part is this happened another 2 times. Each time the woman would refuse to sleep in her room and sleep outside bundled in blankets. Whilst working at a hospital, I was spending the night with another staff member in one of the old back wards, waiting for the coroner to pick up a body. It was just us and the body, as the other clients had been moved to a newly opened ward. The body had been dead for about 6 hours when it started to groan and make weird noises, also moving its legs. Death is weird. At the same hospital, shortly before it closed, I was searching the grounds for a missing client. This was including all empty buildings, one of which was an old morgue, which usually I found a very peaceful place. Considering the amount of tortured souls that would have passed through there, I thought it was a bit weird. During the mid-90s, I worked as a nurse at a home for the mentally disabled. Obviously, there are a bit of weird things that would happen. Most things I am able to shake off with no real concern. After all, a client throwing feces at the wall was an average Tuesday night. I wish I could say this was the creepiest thing I have ever encountered during my 40 years as a nurse, but it isn't. It was morning during shift change. We're changing from the night shift crew, which I was a part of, to the day shift crew, when one of the clients, who was a mute, walked up to the door of the nurse's station with a piece of glass in his hand. We were immediately worried about what he was going to do, and how he got a hold of a piece of glass. But before we could do anything, in front of the 2 sets of staff, he calmly pulled down his pajama pants, sliced open his scrotum, popping out a testicle. This all happened quickly, so we didn't have time to open the door and stop him. But that wasn't the creepiest part, because he then handed the glass to a staff member and went back to bed. Needless to say, we were all stunned. During the late 80s, we had a teenage client who was diagnosed as severely autistic. As such, she had very little comprehension of speech or gestures. The majority of the time, she would never make eye contact. Occasionally, she would become hysterical and manic with a weird grin and stare at you. Many of the staff commented it was not her looking at you during these outbursts, but something evil. And while I do not believe in this sort of thing, yes, what was looking back at you was not her, and it was not good. I did extra shifts with an agency in the late 70s, one of which was a nursing home. While feeding the clients lunch, I was talking to one of the clients who was in her late 80s. She did seem a bit odd, and I noticed most of the other clients avoided her where possible. But I assumed it was due to dementia. Another staff member advised me later to have minimal contact with her as she could be dangerous. I had to record her food and fluid intake in her nursing notes, and thought I'd have a look at her history to see how this frail little old lady could possibly be dangerous. There was, unusually, very little information, other than she had transferred from another home due to an unspecified incident in the late 60s. I found her old notes, which had very little information other than she had been committed to a psychiatric hospital, L Ward, in 1924. It wasn't until I worked there again a few years later that I found out she had died. Also, that the L ward in that hospital had its name changed in the early 30s to the Z ward, which was the ward for those who were classified as criminally insane. The final story I will share with you was when I was working with a totally dependent client. She had no eyes and was a deaf mute. She couldn't physically move due to contractures, and due to her shape she could only lay in one position. So basically, she had no stimulus of any kind, but would hum music when you brushed her hair. That alone was creepy as hell. Number 2. I graduated high school almost a year ago. I had really no urge to attend college or the military and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before me. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up. with a website you may have heard of, called woof.com. Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there and almost immediately my car broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought from Craigslist for $500. Later on I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, was self-absorbed, condescending right out of college, but vapid as shit hipsters. Basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating circles and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I'd been there for weeks, and was desperate for real conversation. And then Michael showed up. I heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to get really involved with the farming, and throw himself into Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew. His unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences punctuated with and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of the friends I left back at home. We became fast friends, as he was the only person who didn't give me the urge to bite off my fingers when they spoke. We're both from Texas, so we both talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course drugs. Every now and then, he brought up subjects that really threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on one of these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point of his absurdity, but I could probably endure it for about a week more. A couple of days later we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure of what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botched siege by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 67 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. "The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up." I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopathic cult leader, interested in power and nothing else. But he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject that I had just explained to him, and he was telling me I'm wrong, and that Koresh was a martyr. This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. "I'm not having this conversation with a fucking loon, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers." The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real silent and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pockets praying I had grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around, so he saw it. He stopped, contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what happened, and that we had to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscious. Late one night, I got a text. "Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling?" I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud banging coming from a barn. I remember thinking it must have been an animal, but also thinking it must have been a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in a corner of my kitchen facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make. Something that you would only hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo. The noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open the door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained me and Michael's history and what happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon, since I believe the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might be out in the woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to pick me up. Number 3. When I was 14, I would spend the summer holidays away from school in home. In the small village I lived in, this meant I mainly spent my days on my own while my parents worked, watching TV and playing The Sims. My parents were generally out of the house from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. I was raised to never answer the door to strangers. However, where I liked to sit in the living room, my chair was next to the window anyway, so I could always see people on the street, and they could see me too, I guess. One day, I was sat watching TV when I noticed a man walking down our street. As our street is a dead end, I normally recognize everyone who walks down it, but I had certainly never seen him before. He was tall, thin and unshaven. He was wearing a hooded jumper with the hood up and the sleeves rolled up, revealing tattoos on his arms. He was carrying a large duffel bag and looking closely at each house as he passed. As I sat watching him, I was clearly in full view of him too. He started to pass our house. When he saw me, he smiled and turned to come down our short drive. He came up to the front door and knocked. I knew I shouldn't answer the door to someone I didn't know, but he had seen me, and at 14 I was afraid of being rude to an adult, so I obediently opened the door a crack. I peeked around the door and said, "Hello?" As he spoke, he pulled the duffel bag around to the front of his body and asked me if my parents were home. At this point, I thought he would probably leave if I said no, but instead he stepped towards the door, unzipping the bag. Well, the thing is, I've just got out of prison. I want to do the right thing, you know. It's hard to find a job, and I'm trying to sell some things, he said, pulling towels, handkerchiefs, and other junk out of his bag. The word prison made my heart sink, and I quickly mumbled something about not having money and closed the door. He stood on the front step for a minute, still talking to me about being able to help. So I went upstairs and waited for him to leave, which he did. I soon settled back down watching TV, and forgot all about the encounter. At 5 p.m. my parents came home, and they took the TV, so I went up to my room. A little while later, there was a knock at the door. I came onto the landing and peered down as my mum answered. 2 police officers were on the step. They asked if anyone had called into our house that day. My mum said no one had, and that was when I remembered my visitor from earlier. I came downstairs and said that actually someone had called. Seeing as I was young, the 2 police officers asked to come inside and talk to me. They asked me to describe the man and the conversation I had with him. They seemed really worried, and kept telling me not to worry and to be honest about what happened. Once I told them what happened, they asked to speak to my parents on their own, and then thanked me and left. I was straight on my parents asking what was going on. My mum explained a few minutes after the guy had come to our house, he had gone to another girl's house. She was in the shower and hadn't answered the door when he knocked. Apparently he let himself into the house and walked upstairs. He found her in the shower and sexually assaulted her. With my description and the evidence from the girl, they tracked the guy down. It turned out he'd just been released from prison for a similar attack on another girl. I never answer the door when I am home alone now. I also don't shower when I'm home alone. Hey guys, Flamingo Creeper here. Thank you for checking out my video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. I post a new video every Monday and Wednesday. But if you're impatient, I do have older videos you can check out if you haven't already seen them. I would like to thank the Reddit users and the creepers who gave me permission to read their stories with you all. The links for the Reddit stories are in the description section if you want to check them out. If you want to send me creepy stories to read to this beautiful creepy community, you can either email them to me or message me over Facebook. Details are in the description for both. Just be sure to leave a brief statement saying I do have your permission. Also let me know if it is a creepy encounter for Monday or a fictional story for Wednesday. If you haven't already, go like my Facebook page. I post daily about various creepy things, ranging from urban legends to serial killers. As always, my creepers, be safe, and remember, the monster isn't under your bed, it's in the street.